When it comes to the connection between mental health and people who are homeless, I think there's kind of a few different buckets of people, or a few different buckets of mental illnesses that have big impacts. I think the one that a lot of people think about is psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia. So I think a lot of people, when they think of homeless folks, they think of somebody with schizophrenia who's paranoid out there, who's trying to avoid people or is on the run. And that's a chunk. I think I recall hearing numbers about 18 to 22% of chronically homeless folks have a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, so something like schizophrenia. And then the other buckets are probably substance use, so folks that are using substance out on the streets or were using and ended up on the streets. And then the big one, I think, is post-traumatic stress disorder or stuff related to trauma. I think that when I think about the people that I treat in clinics that serve primarily homeless people, almost everybody has trauma as a big part of their story, either leading to homelessness or a part of what's maintaining the homelessness. And the interaction that causes in the way a person deals with outreach workers or other supports becomes important, because the way that trauma impacts people is it sometimes results in maybe an inability to have normal back and forth emotional relationships, an inability to establish trust with someone that you don't already know, or someone that reminds you of someone who perpetrated trauma on you, or in a place that reminds you of trauma. So places where there's lots of crowds, lots of people, noisy, people coming in and out, can be a scary place. Well, I mean, I think the simplest interpretation of that is a person who experienced a trauma at a shelter, which is, I mean, I don't have numbers, but relatively common. And so people who've experienced either a sexual trauma, a violent trauma, or like an abandonment-like trauma related to a shelter is going to be reluctant to go back. That's that one is pretty straightforward. And then there's people who have had a high number of traumas starting in early life, specifically traumas that had to do with coming from caregivers or coming from people who they should have been able to trust. And what that creates in the human experience is a mindset that's always in fight, flight, or freeze mode. And shelter environments are very dynamic places. There's moving people, there's a lot of sound, there's a lot of light, it's very disruptive. There's a lot that's not in a person's own control, like when do the doors open, when do the doors close, when is food served, what food is served, what times check in, can you stay during the day, do you have to be out during the day? All of those things for a person who really has struggled with relationships that should have been built on trust can result in that environment being triggering, or that environment making the person feel as if they're back in the traumas that they were experiencing when they were younger. Yeah, so I think in the general population or in popular culture, when we think about PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, the first thing we think about is war veterans. And it's, I think, pretty clear to most of us that the experience of being in war would create an emotional reaction to it, right? When psychiatrists or mental health care providers think about PTSD, when we think about the trauma, we define that as an event that happened to a person that risked their life or was scary to the point that you thought you were going to lose your life. Now, if you're a child, that's different than if you're an adult, right? So if you're a young person and you rely on your caregiver for survival, and that caregiver, let's say, is neglecting you or abandoning you, and you're at home for days on end without access to food or knowing how to get food, right? That would create that same feeling inside that your life is being threatened, right? Or if you have a parent who uses substances and becomes unpredictable, and you don't know if you're coming home from school to a parent that is going to hug you and help you with your homework, or a parent that's going to lock you in the closet or hit you or do some other thing, that, at that age, gives you the experience of being threatened. And when our brains are put under those stresses, they adapt. They create coping mechanisms that are meant to help us survive. And those things create some of the symptom clusters related to post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be re-experiencing symptoms, meaning that when a person is triggered by a reminder that they have a physiologic or a mental experience that's like being in the trauma. Or they can be avoidance, where there's an urge to avoid things that bring back feelings or emotions related to the trauma. There can be onset of negative alterations of your mood or your sense of self, where you're chronically depressed, you're chronically thinking you're worthless, or you blame yourself for the bad things that happen to you, along with other symptoms. And our brains don't know if that happens if we're like overseas in a war, or if it happens in our homes, or it happens while we're driving, home from work and we get T-boned in an intersection. Our brains don't distinguish where it happened. Our brains just know that it did happen. All right, so when we think about why it is that a person's experienced trauma or extensive trauma in their lifetimes might avoid going to a place like a shelter, in the context of post-traumatic stress disorder, or even other disorders related to the traumatic stress they've been in, if maybe they don't technically meet the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the symptom clusters is avoidance. That's in the definition of the illness, that a person would avoid stimuli that would recreate the emotions or the physical sensations of the original trauma, or the stacked traumas on top of each other. And so, if I think about people who grew up in poverty, in homes where there was people coming and going all the time, where there might have been someone selling or using drugs out of the home, where there was unpredictable violence, where a lot of noise coming out of the parent's bedroom meant there was a fight, right? And you go to a shelter environment where a lot of that's, shelters can be quiet places, shelters can be calm places. There's lots of really, really good shelters. But even in the best of circumstances, shelters are dynamic places. There's a lot going on. And that amount of stimuli for a person who has that past experience, to me, it makes sense that it would be avoided. It might be for a person, an individual person, it might feel safer to go sleep unsheltered on a park bench and be at risk of frostbite than to go into a situation where they know they're going to be on edge, they're going to be hypervigilant, they're going to be waiting for something bad to happen, they're not going to get any rest, and they're likely to feel worse. If I were on a planning committee and they were asking me for my opinion, like what would I say, like what do I think would be components of a shelter that would be welcoming to people who've had experiences with trauma? I think that's a challenging question that I'm not sure anyone's answered yet. But I would think about low barriers to entry, high tolerance for flexibility, I guess, like when a person can come and go, right? So, it's a tough one. So, if I was to think about characteristics or approaches at a shelter that would make it a more welcoming environment for people who've been traumatized, and thinking of like the context of trauma, people who have trauma histories, it can be very unpredictable or dynamic or explosive sometimes in the moment very rapidly without any warning, and like what would be useful for a shelter to implement to accommodate for that and to help those people feel welcomed. I would think staff with lived experience. So having people around who are familiar with, I think, lived experience in two different things. One, in being homeless, and then two, in having a mental health history or a trauma history. And having, multiple available at a time, so that if a person was not feeling safe or feeling dysregulated, there would be someone there who could be a first line of support. I think other components I would think about are having all of the staff there trained in how, in trauma-informed approaches, right? So taking a step back and basically saying, like, not like what is this person done or what is this person doing in the moment, but thinking from the perspective of what has happened to this person, what has this person been through that's resulted in, this behavior that we're seeing right now, and then how can I respond in a way that is going to be welcoming and supportive of not only the person in front of me, but also the other people around, which can be really complicated at times. So I think thinking about ways to have to have space. So if a person was having a bad time, right, where's a space they can go to where it's not going to be where they can have quiet or calm or what they need in the moment that's not going to be disrupting other folks, and it's also keeping them safe. So it's not just you're in or you're out, right? Is there like a space, a physical space where a person can have a minute or a few minutes to collect themselves? And then having staff that can help facilitate that in a welcoming way. And I think thinking really, really long and hard about things like, hardline bans, for nonviolent disruptive behavior. I think if the goal is to have people in shelters and not in the streets, right? If a person's banned from a shelter, there's no option for that person, right? And a long-term ban on a person has potentially devastating consequences. And so long-term bans for a person who's violent and is putting other people in the shelter in direct harm makes sense from a societal perspective, right? We're going to say this person's going to be at higher risk. They're going to have to sleep outside because they're too violent in here and they're putting 12 other people at risk or whatever. But for nonviolent behavioral outbursts, having flexibility or having review processes or ethics panels review, something like that, I think would be a reasonable cultural shift maybe. And I honestly don't know what they're doing at shelters here in regards to that. So when it comes to resources for folks who are in acute or in the moment mental health crises, across the country we do not have enough beds. Like we do not have enough inpatient psychiatric beds to manage folks that need that level of care. We also don't have enough intensive outpatient services to adequately manage people who maybe don't need to be in the hospital, but they need more support than just being out on the streets or just in an apartment by themselves or in with their families. And because of that, there becomes this complicated backlog, where you've got people who are boarding in EDs, meaning they've gone to emergency departments for a mental health crisis. They've been, sometimes evaluated for involuntary treatment, and the determination is that they need to go to an inpatient psychiatric hospital involuntarily to be treated to manage the acute crisis, and there's no inpatient beds available, so they end up sitting in an emergency department where they're physically occupying a space that then is not available to somebody else, and then that backs up into the waiting room, and then that backs up, law enforcement, and then if law enforcement gets a call for someone they're that someone is worried about, they might not have any place to take them that they feel is going to be adequate, or they might not have the training to deal with them when they get there. You know, the short answer to that problem is mental health needs aren't appropriately funded anywhere really in our country, and probably not funded because they're not a priority politically or not a priority amongst the general population. And I think that that is even more compounded when it comes to folks that are homeless, because it's not seen and not noticed by, loved ones or family members or coworkers. People can be silently suffering from a mental health crisis and out on the streets, and nobody would notice. And so not only, if they do get noticed and get in line, the line's long, but they're often not even noticed. I would say, the other big thing contributing to homelessness here and across our country is related to structural problems in our societies. Currently we live in a system that allows people to get rich enough to jump in a spaceship and go into outer space, right? And while we drive down the downtown of any city and there's hundreds or thousands of people out there with nothing, or there's people who are working full-time jobs and sleeping in their cars because they can't afford to pay rent, or they've had the misfortune of having a chronic medical illness that's made them miss work and get fired. And so I think beyond like shelters is like, why are there so many people out on the streets to begin with? And while I fully support the idea of getting people off the streets, out of the cold in the winter, avoid frostbite, all that stuff, to me, I think that I would like to look upstream as well and say, like, why is it that we are having a problem in society where so many can't find the space that allows them to participate like everybody else?